If kindness had a sound, the old diner sign creaking in the winter wind might have been it. The storm had arrived without mercy, a wall of white sweeping across the narrow highway like the sky had decided to erase the road entirely. Snow piled against the windows of Carter's diner until the glass looked like frosted milk, and the neon coffee sign flickered weakly against the blizzard outside. Emily Carter stood behind the counter with a dish towel in her hands, watching the empty road disappear beneath another 6 inches of snow. 27 years old, 5'6", honey blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail that had long since escaped its neat shape after a 12-hour shift. She had planned to close an hour ago, but storms had a way of trapping travelers, and travelers meant tips. Tips meant rent. Rent meant the diner might survive another month. Outside, the wind howled so loudly it rattled the metal siding like someone knocking on the building from every direction at once. Emily glanced toward the framed photograph above the pie display. Her father stood in that picture with flour on his apron and a grin that looked permanently warm. He had built this diner with his own hands 30 years earlier. Now the bank owned half of it. And by tomorrow morning, if Emily couldn't make the payment she'd promised, they would likely own the rest. She exhaled slowly and turned off the last burner on the grill. That's it for tonight, she murmured to no one in particular. The snow outside thickened again, spinning sideways in the wind like powdered sugar thrown across the night. Then the headlights appeared. One set at first, then two, then a long string of them cutting through the blizzard like a parade that had taken a wrong turn into the middle of nowhere. Emily leaned closer to the window, squinting through the frost. 15 vehicles, maybe more, crawling along the highway before suddenly slowing to a stop just beyond the parking lot. Doors opened. Dark figures stepped out into the snow, expensive coats instantly dusted white as the wind clawed at them. Even from across the lot, Emily could tell they didn't belong here. Their posture was different. Their movements controlled, impatient, like men used to walking into warm buildings where someone else solved the problems. The diner door burst open a moment later, letting in a violent gust of frozen air that scattered napkins across the floor. The first man stepped inside, tall and sharp-featured, shaking snow from a coat that probably cost more than Emily made in 2 months. Behind him came another, then another. Within seconds, the quiet diner was filled with 15 strangers bringing the storm in with them. Their shoes left melting footprints across the tile. Their watches gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Their voices carried the low confidence of people who rarely heard the word no. Emily folded the towel neatly on the counter and poured 15 mugs of coffee before anyone asked. The men fell quiet as the steam rose into the cold air between them. One of them stepped forward then, removing his gloves slowly, his eyes scanning the modest diner with the calm calculation of someone used to evaluating entire companies in seconds. His name, though Emily didn't know it yet, was Alexander Hayes. Billionaire. Investor. A man whose decisions moved markets and closed factories across 3 continents. Tonight, however, he looked like any other traveler caught in the worst snowstorm the county had seen in 20 years. Emily set the coffee mugs in a line across the counter and said gently, "Storm like this doesn't care how rich you are." She slid the first mug toward them. "Tonight, everyone's just cold." The men exchanged glances. And somewhere behind the quiet clink of porcelain, the storm outside grew louder. The warmth of the coffee did something strange to the room. The tension that had arrived with the men began to soften, not disappear, but bend slightly under the quiet rhythm of steam rising from ceramic mugs. Emily moved behind the counter with the calm efficiency of someone who had worked too many winter nights to panic now. She pulled open the old soup pot on the back burner and stirred slowly, the smell of chicken broth and herbs spreading through the diner like a blanket no heater could match. None of the men spoke for several seconds. They simply stood there, brushing snow from their coats, glancing at one another as if deciding who should speak first. Finally, a younger man near the front cleared his throat and reached for his wallet. He placed a thick stack of cash on the counter without counting it. "We will need food, heat, and a place to. Wait until the road opens," he said, his voice polished and confident. "This should cover the inconvenience." Emily looked at the money for a moment, then gently pushed it back across the counter. "Coffee is $5, she said quietly. "Soup is $6. The man blinked, clearly not used to hearing numbers that small spoken with such certainty. A few of the others exchanged amused looks. But the tall man who had removed his gloves earlier did not smile. Alexander Hayes simply watched her. He had spent most of his life in rooms where people leaned forward the moment he entered, where staff members rushed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Yet this waitress did something unusual. She treated him exactly like everyone else. Emily ladled soup into bowls and slid them across the counter one by one. Her movements were steady, almost graceful, even though the diner heater rattled weakly and the wind outside continued to batter the walls. Roads are probably closed for at least 12 hours, she added. County plows will not reach this stretch of highway until morning. One of the men frowned. 12 hours. Another checked his phone and lifted it toward the window, as if signal might magically appear in the storm. Nothing. No bars. No connection to the world they normally controlled. Emily set a basket of bread beside the soup bowls. You can sit wherever you like, she said. Booth heaters work best along the wall. They moved slowly toward the tables, coats draped over chairs that had seen decades of truck drivers and traveling families. The contrast was almost surreal. Tailored suits. Italian leather shoes. Diamond cufflinks catching the diner lights. Alexander remained at the counter a moment longer. He studied the small details most people ignored. The worn tile floor. The coffee maker that hummed louder than modern machines. The framed photograph of a smiling man above the pie case. His eyes paused on that picture before returning to Emily. You stayed open for strangers during a storm, he said at last. His voice was calm, but there was curiosity inside it. Emily wiped the counter with the same dish towel she had folded earlier. Storms do not ask who deserves help, she replied. Alexander watched her for another moment. Something about the way she spoke was different. Not defensive, not eager to impress, simply certain. Behind him, the men had begun eating, the sound of spoons tapping bowls echoing softly through the diner. Outside, the wind roared louder again, snow now piling halfway up the windows. Emily glanced toward the door, and then toward the dark highway beyond the glass. Looks like you gentlemen picked the only warm building for 20 miles, she said gently. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a stack of folded blankets. You might want these. The blankets were old but clean, thick wool folded carefully the way Emily's father used to stack them every winter. She handed them out one by one as the men settled into the booths along the wall where the heaters hummed the loudest. The storm outside did not weaken. If anything, it grew stronger, wind slamming against the diner like waves against a small boat. Snow climbed higher against the glass until only the faint glow of the parking lot lights remained visible. Inside, the rhythm of the diner slowly returned. Spoons scraped the bottoms of soup bowls. Coffee was poured again and again. Boots thawed near the heaters, leaving small pools of melted snow on the floor that Emily quietly wiped away with a mop. The men spoke more freely now, though their conversations carried the careful tone of people used to discussing important things even when pretending not to. One of them checked his watch and shook his head. We were supposed to reach Albany by midnight, he said. Another man laughed softly. At this rate, we will be lucky if we reach the county line by sunrise. Emily moved between tables refilling coffee without interrupting them. She did not ask questions. She did not show curiosity about their suits or their expensive watches or the quiet authority that surrounded them like a second coat. To her, they were simply 15 travelers trapped by winter. Alexander Hayes watched this with growing interest. From his seat at the end of the counter, he could see everything. The way Emily noticed when a coffee cup was half empty before the customer asked. The way she added extra bread to the basket of the oldest man in the group without saying a word. The way she stepped outside once, just for a moment, to brush snow away from the diner door so it would not freeze shut. Most people performed kindness loudly. Emily did it. The way people breathed. Quietly. Naturally. As if it had never occurred to her that the world might operate differently. Alexander wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug and studied the framed photograph again above the pie display. The man in the picture had the same steady eyes Emily carried now. Your father built this place, he said finally. Emily followed his gaze toward the photograph. For a moment the calm expression she wore shifted slightly, softened by memory. 30 years ago, she replied. He said highways always needed two things. Gas stations and coffee. Alexander nodded slowly. And you kept it running. Emily shrugged lightly as she wiped a nearby table. Someone had to. The lights flickered then. Just once. A small dimming that made every head in the diner turn toward the ceiling at the same time. The heaters rattled louder, as if protesting the storm pressing against the building. Emily walked calmly toward the breaker box near the kitchen door and checked the switches. Everything remained on. Power lines are old out here, she explained. But the generator will start if we lose electricity. One of the men leaned back in his booth, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. You prepared for storms like this often? Emily smiled faintly. Living in upstate New York teaches you to respect winter. Alexander glanced toward the windows again. Snow had nearly buried the lower half of the glass now. The world outside looked silent and endless. A different man might have complained. A different group might have demanded better conditions. But something about the quiet confidence of the waitress had shifted the atmosphere in the room. For the first time that night, the powerful men simply sat still. And in the middle of the storm, Carter's diner felt less like a roadside stop and more like a shelter built exactly for nights like this. The night grew deeper, but the storm refused to rest. Wind scraped against the walls of Carter's diner with a steady roar that sounded almost like the ocean, even though the nearest coastline was hundreds of miles away. Snow pressed harder against the windows, climbing inch by inch until the glass looked buried beneath a silent white wall. Inside, the warmth of the diner had settled into something quieter. The first bowls of soup were long finished. Several of the men leaned back in the booths, their conversations slower now, their voices softer as the long day of travel caught up with them. Emily moved through the room with the same calm rhythm she had kept all evening. Coffee refilled, empty bowls stacked, a fresh pot simmering gently on the stove. She passed a slice of warm apple pie to the oldest man in the group without being asked, sliding it across the table with a small nod, as if she had known all along he would want it. He looked surprised, then grateful. How did you know? He asked. Emily gave a small smile. Everyone wants pie during a snowstorm. The man chuckled quietly and took the first bite. Across the room, Alexander Hayes watched the exchange from his seat at the counter. His eyes followed Emily as she checked the thermostat, adjusted a blanket on the back of a chair, then stepped toward the window to brush a thin layer of frost away with her sleeve so she could see the parking lot outside. The storm showed no mercy. The vehicles were nearly buried now, their shapes reduced to small hills of snow beneath the flickering light of the diner sign. Alexander glanced down at the leather box resting beside his coffee mug. He had carried it with him all evening without setting it far from reach. Even when he removed his coat earlier, the box had remained close to his hand. Emily noticed it the moment she returned to the counter. She did not stare. She simply poured fresh coffee into his mug and said quietly, "That must be important." Alexander looked at the box for a moment before answering. "It belonged to my father." His voice carried a tone that had not been present earlier that night. Something softer. Something closer to memory than authority. Emily nodded once, not pressing for more. Family things usually are. Alexander studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to explain further. Then he opened the leather lid slightly, just enough to reveal a silver watch resting on dark velvet. The metal caught the diner light with a quiet shine. He wore it every day for 30 years, Alexander said, even when the business nearly collapsed. Emily looked at the watch with genuine interest, not the exaggerated admiration people often used around expensive objects. "Looks like it survived a lot of winters," she said gently. Alexander almost smiled at that. Behind them, one of the men at the booth shifted suddenly and coughed into his hand, the sound deeper and heavier than the casual coughs of someone clearing their throat. Emily's attention moved instantly. She stepped across the diner floor without hesitation, placing a hand lightly on the back of the booth as she looked at the older man sitting there. His face had grown pale, his shoulders tense beneath the blanket. "You feeling all right?" she asked softly. The man tried to answer, but paused to catch his breath first. The room grew quiet again. Even the storm outside seemed distant for a moment as 15 powerful men watched the waitress in the small roadside diner take control of the moment with the same steady calm she had shown all night. Emily knelt slightly beside the booth so her eyes were level with the older man. The diner lights reflected softly across the polished wood table while the storm outside continued to roar against the walls. The man drew in a careful breath, one hand pressed against the edge of the table as if steadying himself. His name, though Emily had not asked yet, was Richard Langford, a man whose companies employed thousands across several states. At this moment, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like someone who had simply traveled too far through too much cold. Just a little tight in the chest, he admitted quietly. The words made several of the other men sit straighter in their seats. One reached for his phone again out of habit before remembering there was no signal anywhere within miles. Emily's expression did not change. She simply placed a steady hand on the table and spoke in the same calm tone she had used all night. Have you been out in the cold long? Richard nodded slowly. About 30 minutes when the car stalled. Emily glanced toward the kitchen clock, then toward the heater humming beneath the window. Cold air can make breathing harder for a while, she said gently, especially after a long drive. She reached behind the counter and returned with a glass of warm water and a folded towel. She soaked the towel briefly under the faucet and wrung it out before placing it carefully in Richard's hands. Hold this against your neck, she said. Warmth helps the body settle. The men watched quietly. None of them interrupted. Richard followed her instructions and leaned back slowly against the booth. His breathing steadied little by little. The tension in the room loosened just enough for shoulders to drop again. Emily remained there a moment longer, watching carefully the way someone watches a pot on a stove, patient but attentive. When she saw that his color had begun to return, she gave a small nod. Better. Richard managed a faint smile. Yes. Thank you. A few of the men exchanged relieved glances. Alexander Hayes had not moved from the counter. His eyes followed every detail of the exchange. The steadiness of her voice. The absence of panic. The way she never once acted impressed by the people around her. Emily stood again and returned to the counter, wiping her hands on the dish towel before pouring another round of coffee. The storm outside rattled the building with renewed force, as if reminding them that the small diner was the only warm island for miles in every direction. Richard lifted his mug carefully and looked across the room at Emily. You handled that like someone who has done it before, he said. Emily paused for a moment before answering. My mother has breathing problems in the winter, she explained. You learn a few things after enough long nights. Her voice carried no self-praise, only quiet fact. Alexander glanced again at the leather box beside his mug, then back at the waitress who had just steadied a room full of powerful men without raising her voice once. Something about the moment lingered in the air like the warmth of the coffee. Outside, the storm howled across the dark highway. Inside Carter's diner, the small clock above the kitchen door ticked steadily toward midnight, and none of the 15 men seemed eager to leave the calm that the young waitress had created inside the storm. Midnight settled slowly over Carter's diner, though it was difficult to measure time when the storm outside erased every normal sense of distance and direction. The snow had climbed nearly to the top of the windows now, turning the glass into a dim white glow that reflected the warm light of the diner back into the room. The wind continued to push against the building with steady force, but inside the air had grown calmer, almost peaceful. Several of the men had stretched out across the booths with the wool blankets Emily had given them earlier. Their expensive coats were folded neatly over the backs of chairs, their polished shoes resting near the heaters where the warmth could dry the last of the snow from the leather. Coffee cups rested half empty across the tables, and the quiet ticking of the wall clock had become the loudest sound in the room. Emily moved carefully between the booths collecting the empty mugs, her steps soft enough that she did not disturb the men who had finally begun to sleep. She rinsed the cups in the small sink behind the counter and placed them upside down beside the coffee machine. Then checked the thermostat once more before adding a small log to the cast iron stove that provided extra heat near the kitchen door. The flame caught slowly, casting a soft amber glow across the floor. Alexander Hayes had not slept. He remained seated at the counter, the leather box still resting near his hand, his attention following the quiet movements of the waitress who seemed to know every sound the diner made. Emily noticed him watching and gave a small polite smile. You should try to get some rest, she said quietly. Morning will come slower than you expect in a storm like this. Alexander glanced toward the snow-buried windows. I have spent most of my life waiting for mornings that arrive too quickly, he replied. Emily poured fresh coffee into his mug without asking. The steam rose between them for a moment before she leaned lightly against the counter across from him. Traveling far, she asked. Alexander considered the question before answering. Far enough that a night like this was not part of the plan. Emily nodded gently as if she understood more than he had said. She looked toward the sleeping men scattered across the booths. Plans usually do not include snowstorms, she said. But sometimes storms give people time they did not know they needed. Alexander studied her face carefully. The words were simple, yet the way she said them made them feel less like a casual comment and more like something learned through experience. He tapped the leather box lightly with his finger. "Tomorrow morning, I am supposed to sign a contract that will sell the company my father built," he said. Emily did not react with surprise or curiosity. She simply listened. Alexander opened the box slightly and looked down at the silver watch resting inside. "He started it in a warehouse smaller than this diner," he continued. "Now investors want to move everything overseas." The storm rattled the roof again as if punctuating the thought. Emily rested her hands lightly on the counter. "And you are not sure that is the right decision?" she said softly. Alexander looked up, a little surprised that she had understood so quickly. Emily gave a small shrug. People who are certain usually sleep easier than that. For the first time that night, Alexander Hayes laughed quietly. The sound was brief, but genuine. Around them, the diner remained warm and still, 15 powerful men sleeping beneath borrowed blankets, while the storm continued to bury the highway outside. And behind the counter, a young waitress who had never left this small town had just spoken the kind of truth that boardrooms full of advisors often missed. The storm began to soften sometime after 3 in the morning. The wind no longer struck the diner walls like an angry wave, but moved instead in long, quiet breaths that rattled the sign outside only once every few minutes. Snow still fell, but the fury had faded into a slow, drifting curtain that turned the world beyond the windows into a pale, silent field. Inside Carter's diner, the warmth had settled deeper into the room. The small cast iron stove glowed gently, and the heater beneath the windows hummed with steady determination. Several of the men remained asleep beneath the blankets Emily had given them earlier. One had his head resting on folded arms at the table. Another had leaned back in the booth with his coat pulled up like a pillow. Even Richard Langford slept now, his breathing calm, and even after the tension earlier in the night had passed. Emily moved quietly behind the counter, preparing another pot of coffee for the morning hours. She measured the ground slowly, the way her father had taught her when she was barely tall enough to see over the counter. Outside, the snow continued to gather around the vehicles in the parking lot, but the outlines of the cars had begun to reappear faintly as the storm weakened. Alexander Hayes had finally stood from the counter and walked toward the window. He brushed the frost away with his sleeve and looked out across the quiet highway that stretched into the gray darkness. "Looks like the worst of it has passed," he said softly. Emily glanced toward the window without stopping her work. "Storms usually burn themselves out before sunrise," she replied. "The plows will probably reach this road by late morning." Alexander nodded slowly but did not move away from the glass. The leather box still rested in his hand. After a moment, he spoke again. "When I was 12 years old, my father brought me to the factory floor for the first time," he said. "He told me something I never forgot." Emily listened while pouring hot water into the coffee maker. "He said that a business should never grow so large that it forgets the people who keep the lights on." The machine began to bubble softly as the coffee brewed. "I spent years thinking expansion meant success," Alexander continued. "But somewhere along the way, the company became numbers on paper instead of people in a building." Emily slid a fresh mug across the counter toward him. "Hard to remember small things when the world gets big," she said gently. Alexander looked down at the coffee, then back toward the quiet booths where the other men slept. The powerful investors who had arrived hours earlier now looked almost ordinary beneath the wool blankets of a roadside diner. "Tonight you reminded 15 men of something they forgot," he said quietly. Emily shook her head with a faint smile. "I just made soup and coffee," Alexander almost answered, but the words stopped when the first pale light of morning began to press through the snowy windows. Dawn had arrived slowly, painting the buried highway with a soft gray glow. The storm was ending. The world outside would soon begin moving again. Inside the diner, the clock ticked steadily toward a new day, and none of the men yet understood that the quiet kindness they had been given during the night was about to change far more than a single storm-stranded evening. Morning arrived quietly over Carter's diner, the pale winter sunlight slowly filtering through the snow-covered windows like a gentle promise that the storm had finally passed. The highway outside was no longer invisible beneath the blizzard. Instead, it stretched out in a wide white ribbon, calm and still beneath. A sky that had begun to clear. Snowbanks lined the road like soft hills, and the buried vehicles in the parking lot had regained their shapes beneath the new daylight. Inside the diner, the warmth remained steady. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room as Emily placed a new pot on the counter. One by one, the men began to wake, stretching beneath the wool blankets and blinking against the morning light. Confusion crossed a few faces at first as they remembered where they were. Then memory returned with the sound of wind fading and the sight of the quiet diner that had sheltered them through the long winter night. Richard Langford sat up slowly in his booth and took a careful breath before smiling. "Much better," he said quietly. Emily nodded from behind the counter. "Morning air helps once the storm settles." Another man stood and walked toward the window, brushing a circle in the frost with his sleeve. "The road is visible again," he announced. "Looks like the plows have been through at least once." Chairs shifted. Coats were lifted from the backs of booths. Expensive watches reappeared beneath pressed cuffs as the group slowly returned to the composed posture of men used to schedules and destinations. Emily moved through the room, collecting the folded blankets with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all night. She stacked them neatly beside the counter while pouring coffee for anyone who asked. There was no expectation in her movements, no hint that she expected anything in return for the warmth she had offered them. To her, it was simply another morning in a small roadside diner. Alexander Hayes watched this for a moment before standing from the counter. The leather box rested in his hand again, though now his expression carried something different than the uncertainty he had shown during the night. He stepped toward the group of men who had gathered near the door preparing to leave. "Gentlemen," he said calmly. The room grew still. Alexander rarely needed to raise his voice. When he spoke, people listened. "We were planning to finalize the expansion contract this morning in Albany," he continued. Several of the men nodded, already aware of the schedule they had followed for months. Alexander glanced briefly toward Emily as she wiped the counter near the coffee machine. "The meeting will be postponed," he said. A few eyebrows lifted in quiet surprise, but no one interrupted. Alexander Hayes was not known for making impulsive decisions. "Instead," he continued, "we will review the proposal again. A company that forgets the people who build it is not a company worth expanding." The words hung in the warm diner air for a moment. Some of the men exchanged thoughtful glances. Others simply nodded slowly, as if the long night had given them time to reconsider more than just travel plans. Emily did not comment. She simply placed another mug of coffee near the end of the counter and glanced out the window at the calm road stretching into the morning. The storm had passed, but none of them yet realized that the quiet kindness of one small diner had just changed the direction of decisions worth millions of dollars. The engines started one by one in the quiet morning, the deep hum of powerful vehicles slowly breaking the stillness that had settled over the snow-covered highway. Carter's diner stood exactly as it had the night before, small and steady beside the road, its old neon coffee sign glowing softly against the pale winter sky. The storm had left the world looking newly washed, the air sharp and clean as sunlight reflected off the wide fields of snow stretching for miles in every direction. Emily stood behind the counter wiping the last of the breakfast plates while the men gathered their coats and stepped toward the door. The warmth of the diner lingered around them, a quiet reminder of the long night they had spent there. Richard Langford paused before leaving and placed a few folded bills on the counter. Emily gently pushed the money back toward him. "Breakfast is $8, she said calmly. The older man smiled, recognizing the same quiet rule she had held all night. He left the exact amount and nodded with quiet respect before stepping outside into the morning light. One by one the others followed, their voices softer than the confident tones they had carried when they first entered during the storm. Outside, the parking lot had transformed from a frozen trap into a slow-moving line of engines warming beneath the sunlight. Drivers brushed snow from windshields. Doors closed. Tires rolled carefully through the thick, white powder toward the open road. Alexander Hayes remained inside a moment longer. He stood at the counter looking at the photograph above the pie display again. The picture of the man who had built the diner decades earlier with nothing more than a small loan and the belief that travelers always needed coffee. Emily followed his gaze and gave a small shrug. He liked meeting people passing through, she said quietly. Alexander placed the leather box gently on the counter and opened it one last time. The silver watch rested inside, its hands ticking steadily toward the morning hour. He closed the lid again and slipped the box back into his coat pocket. Your father understood something many businesses forget, he said. Emily tilted her head slightly. What is that? Alexander looked toward the door where the sunlight poured across the floor. That success is not measured by how large a company grows, he answered. It is measured by how many people feel welcome when they walk through the door. Emily smiled softly and returned to rinsing a coffee mug beneath the warm running water. Alexander stepped toward the door, but paused before opening it. You gave 15 strangers warmth during the worst storm of the year, he said. That is not something people forget. Emily simply nodded as if the words were no more unusual than the storm itself. Alexander stepped outside into the bright snow, and the line of vehicles began moving down the quiet highway. The diner returned to silence once the last engine faded into the distance. Emily finished drying the mug and placed it beside the others behind the counter. She glanced once more out the window at the open road, then turned the sign on the door from closed to open as the winter morning continued. Hours later, the quiet highway would begin to buzz again with passing traffic, and before the day ended, a long line of black luxury cars would return to that same small parking lot, bringing with them lawyers, builders, doctors, and bankers who had all received the same message from 15 men who had spent one night inside a roadside diner. Kindness, it turned out, traveled faster than any storm.